Hi and welcome to Bite-Sized Bat Reps, where we bring you great battle reports without taking up a great deal of your time. We're back with another divisional Blitz report. I had a chance to play a fun small divisional game and took some pictures, and it's not quite enough for a full report, but it's enough to put something together and tell you what happened. So this is actually kind of fun. My opponent brought a historic division. It's the division for Prince Radziwill, which is interesting because it combines the Lithuanian, Polish-Lithuanian style cavalry with some Western style troops. So you have hard as nails old style infantry supported by dragoons and Cossack style panzerni and winged hussars. So it's actually kind of a fairly tough division because it takes best of both worlds. On my side, to make the division fit the small format of this game, I dropped my infantry and instead took a couple of dragoons. So my division now has the Raiters as normal, allied Polish Cav, and veteran dragoons. So, and then it's supported by a small artillery battery and an ammunition wagon. To get things going, we both sent our dragoon regiments on reconnaissance, and this is actually kind of funny because both of our regiments just got destroyed in reconnaissance. I ended up rolling 2 10s and failing 1 test, so I lost 5 stands, which, yes, is exactly half of this regiment got lost on reconnaissance. And my opponent, unfortunately for me, was equally unlucky. He also rolled 2 10s and then failed 3 more tests, so he ended up losing 7 stands. So yeah, the dragoons I guess met somewhere on reconnaissance and just wiped each other out. But he did have more dragoons reconnaissance on the mission, so he had a 5-point recon advantage, which he then used to do a forced march with his combined cavalry. And then just to equalize the forces, I had a major delay applied to my allied Polish cav. So my second hitting regiment will be starting the game late. Here's the deployment, and we're playing with the tournament scenario rules. So the objectives are, for me, I ended up being the defender, just the way the roles worked out. I'm defending my deployment zone. My opponent, I think, to break through, so he's going to be trying to get through my lines, and then the neutral objective is this camp. This camp is worth 2 points, and it's basically in my deployment zone, so I need to protect it from my opponent, which is why he set up his forces kind of heavily to the left, because he obviously wants to go through and take this objective. In other deployment news, or what's important to note, my artillery battery was able to take the hill, which is obviously very good for me, and my opponent will put his artillery on the hill and on the other side. My dragoons came in on this side, and so this is all that's left from that regiment, just 5 bases straggling in, and I'm just going to march them here, put them in the camp, and defend this camp. Basically, that's all they can do at this point. My opponent's dragoons are here, and there's actually a village here, so he's going to occupy these 2 buildings, because that's, again, all that his regiment can do now that it's been reduced to half strength. The other thing I wanted to note for deployment, and this is something I'm still basically playing with and trying to figure out what the best approach is, I decided to split my regiment up a little bit. So my mercenary veterans are here, they're all together, but my national veterans are split into 2 groups, like so, because I wanted to divide up the losses that are going to happen on this side. I could have put all of my national veterans in one place here, basically, and then my other regiment here, but this way I figure that as this wave of cavalry comes through and starts killing my raiders, I'm going to have a chance to split the losses between 2 different regiments and maybe not get wiped out right away. Alright, and here's a close-up of the Lithuanian side, the combined regiment, and yeah, you can see that 2 winged hussar bases, which are really hard hitting, but fortunately for me there is only 2 of them, so that's not too bad to deal with. Then some panzerni and regular Cossacks, and on the other side the raiters that are part of the same regiment, that's why it's called combined, and these guys will just advance and kind of hold the Lithuanian left flank. And another view of the battlefield, and you can see my decimated dragoons just coming on here. This column of survivors straggling in, trying to make it to safety. All right, so this is end of turn 1. A lot has happened, as you can see. I'm just going to walk you through all of this. So to begin with, this cavalry force charged, and the way the deployment worked, and because of this field, they were unable to complete the charge, and they kind of ended up here. And these Cossacks failed their skill test right away, so they withdrew back. And then these guys actually did pass their skill test, so they ended up sitting here, but they were taking horrible artillery fire onto their flanks from close range. And at the end of the turn, with the second firing, they ended up failing morale test, because these guys actually, the Panzerni, lost an entire, I think, 3 bases at this point, and so eventually their morale gave way. They withdrew into the Hussars, who at that point failed their nth morale test as well, and they also withdrew. So this charge basically came in, took lots of fire, and kind of pulled back. So it was definitely a failed charge, and that's a great start for my side, because I haven't even had to engage with my raiders yet, and I've already kind of broken down this charging wave. And on the other side, because these raiders are not really that much of a threat, I'm taking my armored raiders and just pulling them to this side, because I want to get rid of this whole force. That's really the punching arm of the Lithuanian division, so I want to get rid of it as quickly as possible, so these guys will come in and hopefully flank them and get rid of them. And here's just another view of the same left flank. All of my cavalry is still basically waiting for the engagement to start. All right, start of the next turn. So the old style infantry is bravely advancing because they are attacking. They're essentially moving forward, so they've been marching across the field. And I really like this formation. This is one of those, I guess, really good ways to use infantry and form them up. So there's a battalion here, which is pikes and musketeers, and that's pretty standard. And then you have these skirmishing commandeered musketeers in the front, which is cool because as I'm shooting at them, I have to shoot at these skirmishers, which are obviously harder to hit, and it keeps these musketeers kind of protected. So I've seen this formation before, and it works really, really well for infantry. All right, turn 2. It goes by fast. So the combined Lithuanian regiment has some really good morale tests, and actually pretty much everything rallies. So the Cossacks, the Hussars, and the Panzerni, all of them rally. And the Panzerni and the Hussars get charge orders, so they charge into my raiders. But there isn't enough command left over to give these guys a charge order. So these Cossacks, the 6 stands, are left not supporting their fellows, which means that the charging forces are actually really severely outnumbered. And at the end of the combat, as you can see, it kind of went, or is going predictably, where I was able to encircle them with all of my rapier forces with basically 2 charges into the flanks, and these guys countercharging, and the artillery was able to fire at first. Now they can't, obviously, because it's protected, but at first they were able to put some fire into here. And these Cossacks are just standing behind and watching because they weren't able to engage just because of the lack of command. And end of the combat, yeah, it goes how it had to, which is Panzerni lost another base and are broken. Hussars lose a base and are broken. They actually flee through all of their forces, but these Cossacks hold. They're really tough, and my raiders just basically advance to their new positions. And I think I ended up actually not losing anything except a couple of wounds. So this was a really one-sided engagement on the left flank. And at the end of the turn 2, to make matters even worse for Lithuanians, my allies show up. This whole massive regiment of Polish cavalry shows up on the right flank and is ready to basically strike through and roll up that whole side. Or that's my plan, but yeah, let's see how it turns out. And the only success the Lithuanians had this turn was actually pretty good. They ended up killing a base of my raiders here, and um, they failed their morale test and they withdrew disorganized. So these guys are now sitting here in a line, but they're totally disorganized. I think it was the dragoons and the arquebuses from these guys that combined fire to destroy a base. Okay, turn 3. So at this point, I'm the defender, and it's I could just kind of sit on my victory conditions and defend the camp, but that's really boring. So I decided to throw caution to the wind and just go really aggressive and basically just start charging as much as I can because why not? It's just so much more fun that way. So these two right here formations get a charge order, and I want to get them to engage these Cossacks and get them off the board, and reposition these guys to move towards the infantry. And the raiders move in, and this is again fairly one-sided engagement because I've got 8 bases of armored raiders going to these 6 Cossack-style cav guys, and no one has impetus field, and the combat goes again kind of predictably with the odds, and I'm breaking them and pursuing them, but not catching them, so they lose a base and to get to have another chance to rally. And this is near the end of the turn, so I reposition my other rapier force here, and the guns now, because this whole side is open, they started focusing on the infantry, and I was able to destroy a base of the skirmishing musketeers, and I think they passed their first morale test, but then second round of shooting I caused some more wounds, and then they'll fail their morale test and flee through their own guys away from my artillery. And end of the turn looks like so, and yeah, you can see that those commandeer musketeers over here because they had to withdraw, and I'm now getting ready to attack with my Polish allies because I want to drive these raiders off the field. The Lithuanian Combined Regiment now has taken quite a few losses, but it was a really large regiment, so it's still actually not close to being broken. So I really want to destroy a bunch of these bases and see if I can get them to break. However, one thing I do want to point out about how the field worked out now. So on this side, you had this charge that was caught and it basically destroyed. And here, I really like what my opponent did because he set up this perfect little pocket. So he has dragoons in buildings here that can fire. He's got a gun, and he's got musketeers. And so there's quite a nice little killing field here. And I basically decide to put my cavalry and run it straight through the guns and see what happens. So we'll see how that goes. A quick look at the camp. I think, yeah, my dragoons are basically dismounted and they got into the camp, and they'll just kind of form up here and just sit here in case anything drastic happens in the field and they need to defend it. And another look across the board. All right, so the right side flank charge. Yeah, it goes kind of how I said it might, which is not very well at all. So a couple of things happen. These Cossacks, they run in here and take all kinds of fire, lose a base, and fail the morale test and withdraw. They bump into this Cossack style cavalry force, and these guys failed their morale test. They also get disorganized, and they also withdraw. So this whole kind of wave basically goes in and comes back out and just mills about disorganized. This little force, however, does make it in. It'll connect with the raiders, but now it's only 3 versus 5, and my frontage is really small, so this is not a good combat to be in at all. So it's kind of funny because on this side, the exact same thing happened as happened to the Lithuanians to this this cavalry, where they basically come in, get shot up, and kind of withdraw. And end of the combat, yeah, you can see here that there's only 2 of these elite Cossack stands because they fought 2 turns and they ended up withdrawing disorganized. They actually got really lucky first part of the combat. It was quite funny. They came in, and I think I ended up making something like 5 armor saves. So I ended up taking very little, very few hits, and won that combat quite handily. But the Lithuanian Raiders held on a 1. And then on the follow-up, the second turn, my depleted elite Cossacks, without their impetus, had to lose. There's just no way for them to win. They lost soundly, lost a base, and failed the morale test, and then withdrew disorganized. So they ended up bouncing. But I did end up taking a couple of bases away from these Raiders, which is, I guess, always good. And the other thing that happened here that's really important is this artillery was just relentless in pounding of the infantry, and they ended up taking a base from the musketeers and forcing a panic test that these guys failed, and they're disorganized. And the reason that's key is now that they lost their order, they're no longer in this battalion. So this battalion is no longer formed, which means these musketeers are on their own, without an order, or actually disorganized at this time. And so I decided that it's a good time for my Raiders to come in and do some damage. Just a close-up on the action. At the beginning of the turn. So I did end up rallying these Cossacks, and I decide to charge this way into these musketeers. And the reason I do that is because the way the map works now is the village is here with the dragoons sitting here, and I was basically worried that if I charge into these Raiders, I'm going to have a repeat of my previous turn with taking a lot of fire into the flank and from these arquebuses and just getting shot up and withdrawing again. So I decided to go to the left, but the issue with doing that is that these guys are armed with the Spanish Marscas as the old style infantry, which hit really, really hard at close range. And I actually think it would have been better going here, taking some flank shots from the dragoons, than going front on into these musketeers. And the way the map actually works, I think my best choice at this time would have been to drive straight through and charge this gun, because I probably would have been out of the fire range for these musketeers and would have been able to wipe it out, get behind the lines, and then do some damage to these regiments from behind. All right, so the charges move in, and yeah, this is actually midway through the charge. So exactly that happened. These guys came in here, and they got shut up by this line of muskets, lose another base, and withdraw disorganized. So yeah, and to make matters worse, I think I moved my Raiders too close again, and they bumped into these guys and disorganized them, and then withdrew them. So again, this whole side basically went up and went back down, not doing anything useful. And then these two stands actually ended up losing another base and just withdrawing as well. All right, but in the center, the Raiders do really well. So they come in here, they end up losing a base because the Musketeers actually fight really hard. They end up nuking one base of the Raiders, but the Raiders still cause more wounds and break them, and the Musketeers flee. They flee through their own pikes, which the pikes fail their morale test and they get disorganized, and so I have a chance to pursue basically into them and cause some wounds and make them withdraw as well. So so this formation is now severely disordered, with one Musketeer unit fleeing, pikes being disorganized, and my Raiders just sitting there right on their edge. And on the left side, two things. One, my Raiders here finally do drive off the Cossacks off the board, so we fought an engagement here that the Swedes ended up winning, and I pushed through and pushed them off the board, so that those bases are gone. And then these two Panzerni, I decide to charge. I think it was one of those attempts to get at this disorganized unit, but with my archers coming in here to support, they ended up fighting them and bouncing and actually fleeing. So these guys are now broken as well. And another look at the right side with my allied cavalry, which keeps on coming up and coming back down. And the artillery on its hill with a commanding view. And actually, one thing that they'll do at the end of the turn here is they'll now focus their fire on this set of musketeers, and they'll force them to get disorganized as well. So these guys will lose their defend order. And this is the end of the turn, and at this point we actually ended up calling the game because we were starting to run out of time, and the Lithuanian force was basically almost gone. Their main regiment, the combined regiment, was testing at -2 for break, so they would flee any turn. The infantry had all of their formations were either disorganized or fleeing, so to put them back into fighting semblance would have taken a lot of command and luck, and all of these forces would be able to basically charge and do some serious damage. So there wasn't much point in continuing. So it was quite the interesting game with basically two sides of action, kind of going the same, where the charges failed. But the thing that is the major takeaway for me is just cavalry spacing. And in division games, it happens all the time where you're within 10 of your leading cav just because there's not enough space, and then something gets disorganized, pushes into your other unit and disorganizes the other unit, and then it pushes into the next unit, and you've got this chain reaction. It doesn't really happen in skirmish games because there is a lot more room, but in division games it's certainly something that keeps on catching me, so I have to pay attention to that. Alright, let's look at how this game went. So in terms of losses, just to quickly tally it up, I had a couple of regiments at half break, and I think these guys, and my opponent had one regiment that was testing for being broken at -2, and the infantry was almost broken as well. They probably would have been broken at the end of the turn, so losses wise, it was the Lithuanian side suffered significant losses as well. And of course, I had all of the scenario objectives completed as well. So it was a Swedish victory. Alright, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this quick divisional game. If you haven't played divisional games, I highly recommend it. And I actually found out that I really like the size of the game, the 35 to 40 point divisional game, because you get through the game fairly quickly. You can actually have a decisive game, and it still feels big. It's a huge step up from a skirmish game, but it's not quite as daunting as a 60 or 70 point divisional game. So if you have smaller divisions, then I really recommend putting together 35 points or so and getting on the table. All right, see you next time on Bite-Sized Bat Reps.